welcome to Leadership Table Talk, a show designed to help you develop and improve your leadership skills and talents. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Gillam, a retired Air Force colonel and former member of the Senior Executive Service Corps with the Department of Defense at the Pentagon. When you think about the law, do you think about its impact on church operations? In today's episode, we're going to discuss what every pastor needs to know about the law. To provide insight and to discuss this important topic with me is retired Department of Justice attorney and pastor George E. Henderson. Having spent over 40 years working as an attorney while serving in numerous ministerial positions, coupled with having actually taught a course similar to this, Pastor George is ready to share with us today. So, Pastor George, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, let's just begin by telling the audience a little bit about your background.
Very well. Well, I grew up in Columbus, Georgia, right on a place called the Chattahoochee River, right across there from Alabama. And having grown up there, I have one sister and three brothers. My parents were hardworking people. They taught us the fear and admonition of the Lord. They really gave us a great opportunity for education. My parents were very much involved with parent-teacher association meetings, very much involved with all of our activities. And so having had that background, I was interested in pursuing a number of things. One was a math teacher initially, but I got off of that, and then at one point I decided I wanted to become a lawyer. And I'll tell you a little bit about what prompted me to desire that profession.
Oh, that's wonderful, Pastor George. Well, you know, when I was reading your bio, I noticed that you did graduate from George Washington Carver High School and that you were a member of the National Honor Society and you were the president of the student body. Oh my goodness, it seemed like you were always prompted for leadership in some capacity, because as I kept reading, I found out that you were also on the dean's list at Mercer University and that you earned your Doctor of Jurisprudence from Vanderbilt Law School. I wanted to make sure I got that right. And so, but again, what inspired you to actually want to become a lawyer?
Very good question. When I was attending middle school, there was an attorney in Columbus, Georgia. There was only one African-American attorney in the entire city. And that particular attorney, his wife worked in the school system, so we got to know this person. And at some point during that particular period, my father, who worked in the construction industry, brought a young man to our home. My mother would prepare meals for the men who worked with my father on weekends. And I met this young man, and later I found out that he had been charged for committing a crime, and he was actually executed. And it tore me up in a great way. And there were many in the African American community who felt that he had basically been railroaded. He was not guilty of what they charged him for. And during that particular time with the racial issues in the South, he was executed. And at that time, I was in about the 10th grade. I said, I want to become an attorney, because I want to defend the rights of persons who did not have their rights protected. And so that's how I became interested in becoming a lawyer.
You know, that is really interesting, because as I was looking through some of the other questions that I wanted to really ask you today, I noticed that you had spent a lot of time working in civil rights at the Department of Justice. And so were there some challenges along the way, or maybe you could talk about some of the successes of the things that you were able to do at the Department of Justice?
Having made the decision that I wanted to become an attorney, and then everything that I did was to excel. I knew I could not make mistakes and be in juvenile delinquent or juvenile detention.
Yes.
So I made some decisions that I had to do well academically, and I did do those things. And I received a scholarship to attend Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. Also, there were some racial issues there that we, of course, faced. And then I had the opportunity to get a scholarship to attend Vanderbilt Law School in Nashville, Tennessee. I knew that I was on the road to doing some things that I really was that were important to me. And when I finished law school, my first work, after having worked at the White House with Jimmy Carter, who was president at that time, I got a position through the Attorney General, Griffin Bell, to actually work for the Civil Rights Division as an attorney. And so that's how my legal career got started.
That is wonderful. So can you talk about some of the things that you actually got to do in the civil rights area that you were working in?
Absolutely. There were a number of cases that came up in the South, basically out of Texas and some other places, and I was a civil rights attorney in what was called employment litigation. There were many African Americans who had not been hired. There were many females who had not been promoted into positions that traditionally had been positions for men. And we brought a lawsuit against an independent school system there in a place called Pasadena, Texas. And out of that lawsuit, I was the lead attorney. At that time, I had reached one of the highest levels that you could reach, and I had a team of attorneys. I had like 3 attorneys who worked with me, 2 or 3 paralegals. And in the preparation of that trial, we spent a month and a half in that particular city. We would send the paralegals home, but the attorneys had to stay. And that was a tremendous time that we had to bring and get the rights of persons who have been denied their rights, those rights brought to a new level. And so we were successful in that lawsuit. In preparation for that lawsuit, one of the things that was really significant, we have to have a team of people. And so how do you bring a team of people who have to be away from their families for long periods of time? And so we had an opportunity to do that. And during that time, my wife was able to help bring food and do things when we were working during the Christmas holidays, preparing for a trial in January. So these are some of the experiences that attorneys go through. If you have a trial date, you must stick with it no matter what is going on in your life.
Oh my goodness. You know, that is so amazing, especially as you was talking about the team aspect of keeping, attorneys together and so forth. So you haven't worked 40 years as an attorney. What advice would you give like a young attorney today?
For a young attorney who's interested in law, people often ask, what should your major be? I would tell a person, almost any major that you have in college would work, but you must be an avid reader. Yes. You must be an analyst. You must be able to take information. I've had people who attended law school with me who were journalists, people who had science, medical backgrounds, but they were avid readers and they thought that law would be an area for them. I happen to major in political science, but that's not a prerequisite to becoming an attorney. So I would say to a person, if you're interested, you have a heart for this particular work, there are causes that you're interested in, law is a great career.
That is awesome. Yeah, I must admit, there was that one time in my life that I actually wanted to be a lawyer. And I was like, oh my goodness. But sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe I should have pursued that. But I now want to transition and talk about the course that you actually taught when you were there at National, and you're still there. But can you talk a little bit about that particular course? It was what was it?
The pastor, the church, and the law.
Exactly. So can you talk about that?
Absolutely. One of the things that pastors have to deal with society being what it is, and people wanting to talk to pastors about any and everything that they think they can provide counseling on. Pastors have to be careful not to give advice on things that they're not qualified to give advice on. Yes. That could lead to liability types of issues. So one of the objectives in teaching this course was to teach young Bible college students some of the things that they should avoid doing. You may have a good heart, you want to do some things, but you can get into a lot of trouble by giving advice outside of your area of expertise. So that was one of the things that I would talk to these young theologians and students about, is making sure that you stay within your lane. There are some things that a person needs to get legal advice on, yes, and you cannot advise them on those areas. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is so awesome, because I know from time to time I run into people and they'll ask questions about things, and I say, well, you have to be careful to make sure that you're not, like you say, giving advice beyond your what you're actually certified to do and so
Absolutely.
forth. Would you say that the course that you taught, it's maybe a course that all Bible colleges should have somewhere in their curriculum?
I really do, because there are so many issues. Negligence is a big issue. People sometimes think that what they're doing is innocent, but if you have information that would suggest that a particular building or place has a potential for danger,
Yes.
There are negligent consequences that you need to face, that you will face, and you need to be aware of those. There are times when people may have children that have been abused, and the question is, who has a duty to report? And each state has statutes, and many people who are theologians won't necessarily know what those statutes are. So you need to either have an attorney, or you need to have someone in your church who can advise you as to look at the law as relate to those particular issues. There are pastors who want to marry someone and they get a call from a friend in another state. You need to know whether or not you as a pastor can go to that state and marry someone. Well, the statutes in that state tell you that. And many pastors who would not necessarily know that might go and perform a marriage that is illegal.
Oh my goodness, wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Because if something were to happen and the person thought that they were legally married,
Right.
and there could be property and other kinds of things, only to find out that the marriage was not properly conducted because the person officiating did not have the proper credentials to do that. For an example, I'm a resident of the state of Maryland, but I'm also licensed to perform marriages in the District of Columbia. So there's a process that you have to be waived in to that jurisdiction in order to do that. But if you don't know that, you may think innocently, you go in there, you perform a wedding, and later on something happens and they find out that the wedding was invalid.
Oh, wow. That is really good information to know, because I would suspect that I'm not the only person who did not know that. Well, Pastor, it looks like we're coming up on a break, so please stay tuned and we will continue this conversation after the break.
As an American, I'm proud of the men and women in our armed forces who every day protect our freedom. That's why I'm also proud to support Help Hospitalized Veterans, a nonprofit organization that offers veterans free therapeutic arts and craft kits specially designed to help them in their recuperation. The kits can also help veterans coping with depression or PTSD. To receive a free kit, call this number or visit hhv.org on the web. Thank you.
Welcome back to Leadership Table Talk. Before the break, Pastor, we were talking about some of the takeaways that in terms of the course that you were teaching there at the National Bible College. What are some of the takeaways that you would want students to really walk away from the course with?
Very good question. One area that all pastors need to know, that they can be held liable for negligence. And negligence can happen in any number of ways. That could be things on the church property that they've observed that has potential for hazard, but took no steps to correct it. Mm-hmm. Someone falls, they hurt, they injure themselves, and then a court, if they bring that action, they might say, you had notice of this particular negligent condition, you did nothing about it, so the person may bring in action that person could be held liable, as well as the church. So that's a very important area of takeaway. Failure to exercise reasonable care is another term often in the law. Yes. If you know of some things, what is a reasonable duty expected of you as a person, as a leader? Thought that was important. Potential liability that a person may have or pastor can have, retaining employees that have a bad reputation for some bad behavior. And rather than reprimanding or firing them, you allow that person to continue. You can be held liable for having notice of behavior that should have been addressed and you did not do that. So these are things that pastors need to know. And then fiduciary duties is another big one, where someone in your church has resources, property, and someone in the clerical role takes advantage of that. Rather than getting family members or other persons to take care of the estate and those things, they could become involved, and then they could be accused of fiduciary negligence. So those are some takeaways that pastors just need to be aware of. There are times when pastors may be dealing with property they want to sell, and maybe they're raising money, they're getting securities. You're not a security agent, you need to have someone who knows security, because those could be issues. You could have nonprofit situations there going on in your church, and you need to be careful of that. You may want to rent the church property for certain things, and you need to make sure there's liability to cover that, because they could come against the church and the individual for liability for negligence. So all of these are things that pastors need to know, to either have an attorney, someone in the church that they can run certain things by before they act on those, or there are occasions when an attorney needs to be hired for specific things, maybe not for run-of-the-mill types of things, but when there are issues that come up that the pastor is clearly not prepared to deal with, it's better to get an expert rather than trying to do it themselves.
Oh my goodness, that is so interesting, because the point that I really drilled down on here is that you can have a church that has maybe a nonprofit who would like to rent the church or use the church for whatever reason, but the pastor has to make sure that, we do take into account the liability question that's there. So
absolutely.
Could you talk a little bit more
absolutely.
about that?
And then there are certain situations where a pastor would be well served to have some type of liability insurance, clergy liability insurance.
Yes.
Why is that important? There are times when members of the church may come to the pastor seeking advice on any number of things.
Yes.
Well, the pastor may speak outside of their lane and give person advice, and they make financial decisions based on what they thought was spiritual advice. The person now loses a lot of money, and now they bring a lawsuit against the pastor saying that I made these decisions based on information that you provided. So it's not something that pastors are required to have, but it's a safety thing to have, is to have some type of liability insurance.
Oh, that is a really good point, Pastor Henderson, because I know as a consultant myself, one of the things that I was taught to do from the very beginning was to have insurance, because the information that you give as part of that business venture, if somebody acts on it, and then like you said, if they lose, unfortunately, or something like that, then they can end up suing you. So you want to make sure that you have insurance to cover yourself. And so that, I apply to myself as a business consultant, but I never really thought about that, from the church perspective, that it's so good that the pastor, or the church has insurance to cover them in case if, somebody wants to come back and say, you do something.
Exactly.
Like
and another area, sometimes a church may want to do something on its property, and they think, well, we own this property, so we can put a fence up, we can put a gate up, and you may need to check the zoning laws in your city, because there are some things that you cannot just do because you want to do them. Or you may want to put up a sign advertising your church, but there could be some ordinances that says that signs have to meet a certain criteria in order for them to be valid. So you spend a lot of money, you get this beautiful sign for your church, only to find out that the city is telling you you have to take it down.
Wow. Wow.
Yes.
I think that's a shock. Well,
Exactly.
Pastor, let me ask you, we kind of hit on this a little bit, but in terms of those pitfalls that, the pastor or the church can fall into without getting the right legal advice, could you kind of expound on some of the pitfalls?
Absolutely. There's something called the clergy penitent rule. That's a rule that has to do with someone who maybe comes to the pastor and they maybe have even committed a crime, and they are trying to find out from the pastor what they should do. And they went to the pastor to talk confidentially about a moral issue. Well, there's a clergy penitent rule that protects that person from that information being divulged from the pastor to even law enforcement. There are some statutes that actually exist that gives that protection. So a person shares information with the clergy believing that that's their spiritual leader, and then that person goes and shares that information to a third party, that person who the information was revealed on can bring an action against a pastor because they reveal confidential information that they gave in a clerical confidential relationship. So these are the kinds of things that can be problematic. Also, you may have heard that a child has experienced some type of child abuse. There are statutes in each state that tells which persons are required to report. Usually teachers, medical professionals, clergy, there is a duty to report, wherein there could be other persons who may be aware, but the law does not require them. It's just a moral obligation. But for clerical, medical, and teachers, actions can be brought against them by the state if they fail to report such things to the proper authorities.
Oh my goodness, wow. And that is really interesting because a lot of times, you know, I'm going to say this because I think it's really good that pastors do get training, you know, go either to some form of Bible college or some kind of training that will enable them to make sure that they are aware of the kind of things that you may not necessarily be aware of if you've not been, you know, educated maybe in a formal setting of some kind. Because I know that, you know, I do believe that you can become a pastor. You know what I'm trying to say is that some people may not necessarily have any training whatsoever and they step out, but because of the things that you can be held accountable for, now that you're serving in that capacity, you have to make sure that you have the proper training. Would you agree to a certain extent?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the other things that oftentimes can happen in a church, you may have the director of music in the church, and they use the church property, the instruments and those types of things, and they maybe make a recording or they even write a song while they are on the church property, using the church property. And many times those persons think that that music and those songs belong to them. But if they were working on church property and church time, it belongs to the church.
Yes, exactly.
And that has been the source of some major lawsuits. Persons thought that they owned that, only to find out that the church owned it.
I know a little bit about that from the standpoint of writing books, and that if I hire someone to do the art for me or the cover or something like that, I have to make sure that I have the rights to that because they created it and they may think that they own it, but I know you were hired by me to create this for me, and I have the, you know, the ability to be able to use it wherever because it does belong to me because you were hired. But there have been people who actually thought that it belonged to them because they created it. No, you were working for me at the time that you created it and stuff.
Absolutely, and these are the kinds of things that can get a pastor or someone in the area of clergy into serious problems, and they very innocently walked into it having no idea of the consequences of that particular thing they were doing. Zoning, for example, a pastor needs to, if they are going to do some things on the property, they need to have an attorney to check the zoning laws to make sure that what they're proposing to do falls within the zoning requirements of that jurisdiction.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Wow. There's just so many things that I believe that the pastor needs to be aware of when it comes to the law. So let me ask, or there's some other things that, you know, that we may not have covered that you think are very important in this regard. In terms of...
Yes. Well, the question that you also raised about whether or not a course like this is a valuable tool, I would definitely say yes. We offered that at our Bible college. I taught that course. Richard Hammer is the person who's the author. It's a 4-volume set, and there are churches who may wish to get that. There are some things from that, from reading it, you will glean information. If you aren't able to take a course, It's well written. It's a 4-volume set. I don't know how recent the set is now because it's been a few years that I taught it, but the information, the case law that was set forth in that, and then Richard Hammer also has a series of materials that you can just order on a monthly basis. So he has a newsletter that can be obtained. So if anyone is interested, they can just Google that name, Richard Hammer, Hammod, Richard Hammer, and they can find materials that that person has. And all of his materials that I've used, I found them to be very valuable.
That is awesome. Well, Pastor Henderson, I don't know where the time has gone, but it looks like we are just coming up on the end of the show. But I do want to thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to come and just share with us such insight about the pastor, the church, and the law. I think that it will be very beneficial for everyone who's watched the show and will watch it and so forth. But I do want to thank you again. And I want to thank you, our listening audience, for watching today. I hope that you have not only been inspired, but you've got a greater understanding of the law and its impact on church operations. Again, thank you for watching. This is Dr. Mary Gillam, and I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye for today.